everyone was told, from Rupert Murdoch, from Fox, to every studio, look, if you touch this thing, you will be out, you will be done. You'll be finished in 3 years.
The United States is the number 1 consumer year after year. And oftentimes we're close to number 1 in production.
I looked directly at the emails that have been widely circulated pertaining to the age 11, and I have it written down on my notes, the permission to kill email, the Snow White, the littlest girl was naughty, etc. And some of them pertaining to, jerky, whatever that is. Yeah.
Something strange is happening, and most people aren't connecting the dots. An actor Jim Caviezel, claims he faced serious backlash after choosing to star in Sound of Freedom, a film about child trafficking that somehow sat unreleased for years. At the same time, documents connected to Jeffrey Epstein started surfacing, filled with names, strange language, and unanswered questions. Then, you hear a sitting member of Congress reading emails out loud, and even they admit something doesn't sound right. Meanwhile, a former federal agent, Tim Ballard, describes a world most people never see, one involving networks, power, and silence. And somehow, powerful figures like Oprah Winfrey keep appearing in the same conversations, sparking debate, raising eyebrows, and leaving people wondering what's coincidence and what's not. Is this all just noise? Or are we looking at pieces of a much bigger picture that nobody wants fully exposed? Because once you start connecting these stories, it becomes very hard to ignore what might be hiding in plain sight. When people talk about Hollywood success stories, the journey of Jim Caviezel stands out, but not in the way you might expect. Before controversy, before headlines, before Sound of Freedom, Caviezel was already known worldwide for one of the most intense roles ever put on screen: his portrayal of Jesus in The Passion of the Christ. It wasn't just another acting job. It was physically brutal, emotionally draining, and, according to Caviezel himself, nearly life-threatening. During filming, he dealt with hypothermia. He suffered injuries that would sideline most actors. And in one of the most talked-about incidents, he was reportedly struck by lightning while on set. Whether you see that as coincidence or something symbolic, it added to the legend around both the film and the actor. The movie went on to become a massive success, earning hundreds of millions of dollars and opening doors across the industry. For most actors, that kind of momentum leads to bigger roles, bigger contracts, and deeper integration into Hollywood's inner circle. But that's not the path Caviezel chose. Instead, years later, he became attached to a project that would change everything: Sound of Freedom. A film based on the work of Tim Ballard, a former government agent who spent over a decade investigating crimes involving child exploitation. Ballard's job wasn't theoretical. It involved real operations in multiple countries, dealing with cases most people would struggle to even hear about. Over time, he built a reputation for going undercover, working in dangerous environments, and focusing on rescuing children from trafficking situations. Eventually, he left his government role and helped launch an independent organization aimed at continuing that work outside official channels. His story became the foundation for the film. On paper, it had everything needed for a standard Hollywood release: a recognizable lead actor, a real-life story, and a subject that would seem universally important. But what happened next didn't follow the usual script. The film was completed, and then it just sat there. Not for weeks, not for months, for years. During that time, major studios that had the ability to distribute it chose not to move forward. There are documented business reasons often cited: corporate mergers, shifting priorities, uncertainty about audience reception. But critics of the situation have long questioned whether that fully explains the delay. From Caviezel's perspective, the experience felt like something more than just a business decision. In interviews, he suggested there was resistance, not necessarily from one single source, but from a broader system that didn't seem eager to support the project. Whether that interpretation is accurate or not is still debated. What isn't debated is what happened when the film finally reached audiences. Without the backing of a major studio, Sound of Freedom was released independently through Angel Studios. There were no massive marketing campaigns, no typical late-night show promotions, no traditional Hollywood rollout, and yet people showed up. The film began selling out theaters. Word spread organically. Audiences who watched it encouraged others to do the same. What started as a modest release turned into something much bigger than anyone in the industry had predicted. It became one of the most talked about independent films of its time. But for Caviezel, the most important moment didn't happen at the box office. It happened in a theater during an early screening. He described sitting among the audience, paying attention not just to the film, but to the reactions around him. At one specific point in the movie, something unusual kept happening. People weren't just watching quietly, they were reacting in a way that stood out. At first, he thought maybe something in the scene wasn't working. Maybe it was confusing. Maybe the pacing was off. But then it happened again. And again. Eventually, he understood what was going on. According to him, multiple audience members were making the same connection, one that wasn't explicitly stated in the film, but was clearly on their minds. They were thinking about Jeffrey Epstein. Epstein's case had already become one of the most widely discussed scandals in recent memory. His private island, his network of associates, and the scale of his crimes had raised serious questions about how such operations could exist for so long without being stopped. So when viewers saw a story involving trafficking networks, isolated locations, and hidden systems of power, many of them connected it to what they had already heard in the news. That moment stuck with Caviezel because it suggested something important. Not necessarily that the stories were directly linked, but that the public was beginning to see patterns. And that's where the conversation shifts from a single film to something broader. When Tim Ballard talks about his experiences, he often describes these issues not as isolated incidents, but as part of larger systems. Systems that rely on secrecy, complexity, and sometimes the assumption that most people will never look closely enough to understand what's happening. He has used metaphors to explain it, comparing it to something that can't be stopped by addressing just one part at a time. Because when one piece is removed, another can take its place. That doesn't mean every claim made about these systems is accurate. It does mean that the problem itself is real and more complicated than it appears on the surface. And as more information has become public, especially through legal cases and document releases related to Epstein, the amount of discussion has only increased. Names appear, connections are suggested, some are confirmed, others remain unclear. And in that uncertainty, different narratives begin to form. Some people focus strictly on verified facts, what can be proven in court, what has been officially documented. Others look at patterns and associations, asking whether there's more beneath the surface. Caviezel has positioned himself firmly in the second group. He has spoken openly about what he believes is a lack of attention from mainstream institutions when it comes to these issues. He's also addressed the criticism he's received, including being labeled as controversial or even dismissed by parts of the media. From his perspective, that reaction only reinforces his concerns. From the perspective of his critics, it raises questions about how far those claims should go without concrete evidence. And that tension between what is known, what is suspected, and what is debated is exactly where this story lives. Because at its core, this isn't just about one actor or one film. It's about how information spreads, how stories are framed, and how people decide what to believe when the facts are complicated, incomplete, or still unfolding. And as more voices enter the conversation, from journalists to investigators to public figures, the picture doesn't necessarily become clearer. In many ways, it becomes more complex, which leads to the next part of the story. Because once you move beyond the film and the performances, you start to look at the documents, the language, and the details that continue to raise questions, even among people who are directly reviewing them. And that's where things take a different turn. As the conversation moves beyond films and public reactions, it starts to center on something far more complex: documents, records, and the challenge of interpreting what they actually mean. When materials connected to Jeffrey Epstein began surfacing more widely, people expected clear answers. Names, dates, locations, something concrete that would fully explain how everything operated. But that's not what they got. Instead, what emerged was a mix of partial information: flight logs, contact lists, fragments of communication, legal filings that revealed pieces of a much larger puzzle, but rarely the entire picture at once. For investigators and journalists, this isn't unusual. Complex cases often unfold slowly, with details appearing over time. But for the public, it created a different kind of reaction: confusion. Because when information is incomplete, people try to fill in the gaps. One of the more talked about aspects of these documents has been the language used in certain communications. In some cases, phrases appeared that didn't seem to match normal conversation, words that felt out of place, references that didn't fully make sense on their own. This led to speculation. Some observers suggested that these could be examples of coded language, terms used to disguise meaning. Others argued that without clear context, it's impossible to assign specific interpretations. Even individuals reviewing the material in official settings have acknowledged that certain parts are difficult to understand at face value, and that uncertainty has only fueled more debate. Because when something doesn't make immediate sense, it invites questions. What does it actually mean? Is it being taken out of context? Or is there something deeper that hasn't been fully explained? At this stage, there are no universally accepted answers to those questions, and that's important to understand. Because while the existence of the documents is real, the interpretation of their content varies widely depending on who is looking at them and what assumptions they bring. At the same time, the broader issue of trafficking, and specifically child exploitation, remains a confirmed global problem. Organizations around the world, including law enforcement agencies, continue to report cases every year. When Tim Ballard describes his experience working in this field, he often emphasizes how organized and adaptive these networks can be. They don't operate in obvious ways. They rely on layers, on distance, on systems that make it difficult to trace activity from one level to another. And one of the most important points he has made in interviews is that these systems don't survive because of one single factor. They persist because of a combination of elements: demand, opportunity, and the ability to avoid detection. That last part is critical. Avoiding detection doesn't always require something dramatic. Sometimes it's as simple as staying under the radar, blending into environments where no one is actively looking. Which brings the conversation back to public awareness. Because awareness is unpredictable. Some stories dominate headlines for weeks, others barely register, even if they involve serious issues. The difference often comes down to how the information is presented, who is talking about it, and how much attention it receives from major media platforms. This is something that has been pointed out repeatedly by people discussing these topics. Why do certain events receive massive coverage, while others, sometimes equally significant, are mentioned briefly and then disappear? There isn't a single answer. Media organizations make decisions based on many factors: audience interest, editorial priorities, available evidence, and the need to verify information before reporting it widely. At the same time, critics argue that this process can create gaps in coverage, where some stories don't get the level of attention they might deserve. And that perception plays a big role in how narratives develop. When people feel that information is being overlooked or underreported, they start looking elsewhere. Alternative platforms, independent creators, long-form discussions that go beyond traditional news formats. That's where a lot of these conversations have expanded in recent years. Podcasts, interviews, online videos. In these spaces, individuals like Jim Caviezel and Tim Ballard have been able to speak at length about their perspectives, often without the time constraints or editorial filters of traditional media. And those conversations have reached large audiences. But they've also introduced another challenge. Because when discussions are less structured, they can include a mix of verified information, personal interpretation, and speculation, all presented together. For viewers, separating those elements isn't always easy, and that's where critical thinking becomes essential. Not everything said in an interview carries the same weight. First-hand experiences are different from second-hand accounts. Verified facts are different from assumptions. Understanding those distinctions is key to making sense of complex topics like this. At the same time, it's also important to recognize that not all connections are meaningful. One of the most common patterns in discussions around Epstein's case has been the idea of association. Who was connected to whom? Who attended the same events? Who appeared in the same records? These associations can raise questions, especially when they involve high-profile individuals. But association alone doesn't establish wrongdoing. This is a point that comes up frequently in legal contexts. Being mentioned in a document, appearing in a contact list, or being photographed at the same event does not, by itself, indicate involvement in criminal activity. And yet, in public discussions, those distinctions can sometimes become blurred. Names carry weight, especially when they are widely recognized. When someone like Oprah Winfrey appears in the broader conversation, even indirectly, it draws attention. It leads to more questions, more speculation. But again, the key issue is evidence. What can be confirmed? What has been proven? And what remains unverified? Those questions don't always have immediate answers. And in the absence of clear conclusions, people tend to form their own interpretations. Some approach the situation cautiously, focusing only on what can be backed by reliable sources. Others look at patterns and draw broader conclusions based on how different pieces seem to fit together. Neither approach fully resolves the uncertainty, because the reality is, complex cases rarely provide simple explanations. There are always gaps, always details that remain unclear, always information that takes time to fully emerge. And while that process unfolds, the conversation continues to evolve. New interviews, new perspectives, new pieces of information, each adding another layer to an already complicated picture. For some, that ongoing complexity is frustrating. They want clear answers, definitive conclusions, something solid to hold on to. For others, it's a reminder that not everything can be understood immediately, that sometimes the full story takes years to come into focus, and even then, it may never be completely clear. Which brings us to another important aspect of this discussion: how influence and perception can shape the way people interpret information. Because beyond the documents, beyond the interviews, beyond the headlines, there's another factor at play: trust. Who people trust, why they trust them, and how that trust affects what they're willing to believe. And once you start looking at the role trust plays in all of this, the story takes on an entirely different dimension, one that goes beyond facts and into something much more psychological. At a certain point, this conversation stops being only about documents, films, or individual cases, and starts becoming about something deeper: trust. Because in situations where information is incomplete, complex, or constantly evolving, people don't rely only on facts. They rely on who they believe. And that's where influence becomes one of the most powerful forces in the entire story. For decades, figures like Oprah Winfrey have built more than just careers. They've built credibility, a level of public trust that goes far beyond entertainment. When someone reaches that level, their presence alone sends a signal. If they support someone, people feel more comfortable. If they introduce someone, that person gains instant legitimacy. If they stay silent, that silence can be interpreted in multiple ways. That kind of influence isn't inherently negative. In many cases, it's been used to highlight important issues, support causes, and bring attention to stories that might otherwise go unnoticed. But it also means that proximity, who stands next to whom, can shape perception in powerful ways. This idea became especially relevant when discussions around figures like Harvey Weinstein began to unfold. For years, Weinstein operated at the highest levels of Hollywood. He was respected, connected, and widely accepted within the industry. Many people interacted with him professionally, attended the same events, and appeared in the same social circles. At the time, Those associations didn't raise alarms for most people. But after allegations against him became public and were eventually proven in court, the way those past connections were viewed changed dramatically. Suddenly, the question wasn't just about what Weinstein had done. It became about who knew, who suspected, and who, intentionally or not, helped create an environment where he was trusted. This is where the concept of social validation becomes important. People often judge safety based on context. If someone is surrounded by respected individuals, they are more likely to be perceived as trustworthy, not because of direct evidence, but because of association. It's a natural human response, and it doesn't require any coordinated effort to happen. It can emerge organically, simply through repeated exposure in credible environments. When Caviezel and others talk about systems or networks, this is one of the dynamics they are often pointing toward. Not necessarily a single organized structure, but a pattern of interactions that can unintentionally reinforce trust where it may not be deserved. That doesn't mean everyone involved is aware of wrongdoing. In fact, one of the most consistent findings in psychological research is that people are often unaware of the larger implications of their actions when they are operating within familiar environments. They trust what feels normal. They rely on signals from others. They assume that if something were seriously wrong, it would already be exposed. But history shows that this isn't always the case. There have been multiple instances, across different industries and institutions, where serious issues remained hidden for years, sometimes decades, before coming to light. And when they do, the reaction is often the same. How did this go unnoticed for so long? The answer is rarely simple. It usually involves a combination of factors: power dynamics, social influence, lack of transparency, and in some cases, the reluctance to question established figures. This brings the conversation back to the present, because the questions being asked now aren't just about past events. They're about how people interpret what they're seeing today. When new information appears, whether it's a document, an interview, or a public statement, people process it through the lens of their existing beliefs. If they already trust a source, they're more likely to accept what it says. If they're skeptical, they're more likely to question it. And in a highly connected world, where information spreads instantly, those different interpretations can coexist and even compete with each other. That's exactly what's happening in this case. On one side, there are individuals who believe that the available information points to deeper, more systemic issues, connections that haven't been fully explored, patterns that deserve closer examination. On the other side, there are those who emphasize the importance of evidence, arguing that conclusions should only be drawn from what can be clearly proven, especially when serious allegations are involved. Both perspectives are part of the same conversation, and neither one fully eliminates the uncertainty. Because the truth is, not every question has been answered, not every detail has been clarified, and not every claim has been verified. That doesn't mean there's nothing worth examining, but it does mean that careful distinction is necessary between what is known, what is suspected, and what is still unknown. For Jim Caviezel, this distinction hasn't stopped him from speaking out. He continues to frame the issue as something that requires attention, something that shouldn't be ignored simply because it's uncomfortable or complicated. For Tim Ballard, the focus remains on the reality of the problem itself, the fact that trafficking exists, that victims are affected, and that efforts to address it need to continue regardless of public debate. And for the public, the role is different. It's not about having all the answers. It's about how information is approached, whether people take the time to question what they see, whether they look for reliable sources, whether they recognize the difference between confirmed facts and interpretations. Because in situations like this, the way people think matters just as much as the information itself. If conclusions are drawn too quickly, important details can be missed. If skepticism turns into dismissal, real issues can be overlooked. And if speculation is treated as certainty, it can distort the entire conversation. Finding the balance isn't easy. It requires attention, patience, and a willingness to accept that some aspects of the story may remain unresolved for a long time. But that doesn't make the conversation meaningless. In many ways, it makes it more important, because it highlights how complex issues are understood in real time, how narratives form, how perspectives shift, and how people navigate uncertainty in an age of constant information. And as this story continues to develop, one thing remains clear. It's not just about what is revealed, it's about how those revelations are interpreted. Because the difference between awareness and misunderstanding often comes down to one thing: how carefully people are willing to look. Now you've heard the story. From Jim Caviezel and Sound of Freedom, to the questions surrounding Jeffrey Epstein, to the larger conversation about influence, perception, and truth. But here's the real question. What do you think? Do these connections mean something deeper? Or are we seeing patterns where none actually exist? In a world filled with constant information, it's easy to accept headlines at face value. But real understanding comes from asking questions, looking deeper, and thinking critically. So if this made you stop and think, even for a moment, don't just scroll past it. Drop your thoughts in the comments, start the conversation. And if you want more breakdowns like this, stories that go beyond the surface and challenge what you think you know, make sure you hit subscribe and turn on notifications. Because the more you understand how these narratives are built, the harder it becomes to be misled by them.